I want to start by saying how honored and excited I am to be participating in a conference here and at such an august institution. Um, I want to thank the organizing committee in particular for agreeing to look at a proposal for a paper in English, and to the auditors for listening in English. At this point, my Spanish is good enough to follow papers, but just bad enough that it would not be a favor to anyone for me to present in Spanish. This is a work in progress, part of a project on field recording. I would welcome comments, particularly on the sort of major terms and concepts, since I've left the paper rather under-theorized in the interests of time. And particularly, I'd love to hear about what people thought about musical passage, how people heard the various musical passages that I'll play. Thanks. Alvin Curran's work of the late 70s and early 80s is formally preoccupied with the boundaries between music and other kinds of sound. After the heyday of his work with the avant-garde improvisation cooperative Música Electrónica Viva, Curran continued to work in Rome, running an independent record label with Giacinto Scelsi and Roberto Laneri, and releasing a series of recordings, many solo and some collaborating with the likes of John Cage, George Lewis, and Pauline Oliveros. During this period, Curran's use of field recording renders this boundary between the musical and the extramusical permeable. For instance, these works incorporate sounds not made by musical instruments and not made for musical purposes, but rather appropriated from other functions, such as flies, airplanes, fireworks, lawnmowers, a purring cat, and pile drivers. Also, Curran brings in sounds that appear at first to be heard not so much musically as context or background, such as air whooshing over microphones and other ambient sounds that would normally be removed from a modern recording of music in the studio. And yet sometimes such sounds come to play a musical role in the context of other sounds, even when they remain audible as coming from a non-musical source. Curran is rarely in a rush, however. These sounds may persist for seconds or even minutes before after coming to play a discernible function in musical form. On Fiori Chiari, Fiori Oscuri, for example, the toy piano and children's voices drop out of the mix, leaving Curran's piano to pursue a lengthy minimalist exercise and then a rollicking, multi-idiomatic rendition of Hoagy Carmichael's Georgia on My Mind. Do we maintain for these 8 minutes or so the sense that we are in a space where piano coexists with such other elements, or do we forget, entering the non-space that is studio recording, only to be jolted out again with the entry of a dog's barking? Finally, these pieces incorporate sounds from the world that obliquely reference a musical function, such as, in several works, the appearance of birdsong, or, in Fiori Chiari, the recording of a young boy trying to master his numbers in Italian. The sounds captured by a field recording and brought into these pieces are acousmatic. That is, they are sounds one hears without seeing the cause. Our not being present to the moment of recording abstracts sounds from their usual functions and associations so that we may listen to those sounds in other ways, including musically. At the far end of this process is pure abstraction, the reduction, as Pierre Schaeffer would have it, to the traits of the sound itself, independent of its cause and of its meaning. For Schaeffer, in other words, reduced listening excludes semantic listening for codes, such as language, and causal listening for sources. At the other end of the spectrum from Schaeffer, conversely, is a roughly contemporaneous way of thinking about music and its others that we can associate with John Cage. Music, for Cage, includes just about any manifest sound to which we pay a certain kind of attention. At each of these two poles, the question of what's musical is resolved ahead of time, not in the context of the musical work as such. In this presentation, I'd like to show how Curran's works from this period explore the rich ground between these two poles. The acousmatism of these works does not reduce causal and semantic listening out of existence or render them merely incidental. Nor, however, do these works simply transcend the boundary between the musical and the extramusical. Rather, the boundary between the musical and the extramusical is formulated in two different moments. First, in the context of all the sounds or musical elements we hear at a given moment, sonic elements can be considered on their own. In other words, someone coughs at the symphony, but we don't hear that as part of the music. Or similarly, when the dog's barking rejoins Curran's piano in Fiori Chiari, we are likely to hear it, at least at first, as a background disturbance, separate from the composition. Second, however, the relationship between part and whole here is of a dynamic character. In entering the pre-existing context of a piece, elements are acted upon by the totality, and, of course, act upon the totality, transforming the terms on which individual elements add up. This new totality, in turn, transforms our sense of the terms on which we might experience that element as musical. It is a chicken and egg dynamic. The sonic function of the whole, the extent and kind of its being musical, is thus various and constantly in flux. Indeed, if it were more teleological, we could call this variation the development of these pieces. We can hear some of these dynamics more concretely in a passage from natural history, which in fact seems designed to explore this chicken and egg problem in form. The structure of this work, made up entirely of field recordings, is extremely stable and repetitive, schematic even. A sound or group of sounds from one field recording enters, eventually to be joined by another. Often, before yet another enters, the first sound fades out, but it may return intermittently. Each sound, or rather each field recording, is listed on the cover of the cassette and on the cover of the recent LP release. Two cicadas in Liguria, for example, or jump rope. Thus, Francis Plagny's description of the form of Fiori Chiari is even more true of natural history. Rather than simply an expedient way of getting from one sound to another, the crossfade is the core of this music. The opening to side B of natural history provides a kind of overture to the long connected piece that takes up the whole side, and it seems to me especially interested in the binary opposition between the musical and the extra-musical. This opening passage rehearses the kind of sounds and engenders the kinds of listening that will be central to the whole 31-minute piece, raising the questions, what did we hear as music, and what happens when sound not created as music passes into music. As this side of the cassette begins to unfurl, one is confronted with a hard-to-place, rhythmic, irregular buzz, a square wave modulated in pitch, pulse width, and quite erratically in amplitude. On speakers, this may sound less like any recorded sound than one's home stereo malfunctioning, an exaggerated version of the noise produced by a scratchy volume knob. At one point or another, we are likely to recognize this buzz as a representational sound, a fly making short little bursts of flight. Doing so may be aided by the recognition of other sounds. First, the relatively quiet background sounds of birds chirping, and eventually the entry of a piano, tentatively exploring a few standard intervals. So recognizing the representational nature of other sounds confirms that the buzzing is at least coming from the recording and is probably also the sound of something. Thus, here, in ways that accord with the piece's formal strategies, modes of hearing are enabled not by the natures of individual sounds, but rather by the forms of relation among sounds, here the minimal elaboration of a context, and that the ways that those relations evolve in time, indicating their own uses and meanings by cueing our modes of listening. Especially since the fly's erratic buzzing, percussive yet repetitive and varied, is not without its own formal energy, the piano's entry might be taken to confirm that we are indeed listening to music. Rather quickly, however, repetitive octaves reveal that the piano is in need of tuning and that it is in the process of being tuned. So we have a musical instrument, and of course in some ways the musical instrument, doing pretty much the only categorically non-musical thing it can do, in sound at least. From the perspective of the moment in which we recognize the use of the piano to be tuning and not music making, we also recognize in retrospect that any prior audition of the piano as musical was not motivated by the inherently musical character of the sound, but rather by associations dependent upon causal listening. In other words, this is a piano. Pianos are for music. Let's listen just a little further, however. Ultimately, as the piano comes into tune, the whole thing may also be considered as an elaborate joke about an orchestra. This one including not only the piano, but the fly, eventually a barking dog, a peacock, and a hoopoe bird, tuning up at the beginning of a performance. Indeed, the hoopoe's monotonous call mimics the way an orchestral instrument provides a reference tone for other musicians. As this tuning up completes and the passage's various elements stabilize in repetition, it becomes more and more possible to hear them as inhabiting a single acoustic space. It's easy to imagine the fly's zigzag movement positioning it stuck in the window or screen, with the piano inside and outside a dog barking in the distance, and eventually various kinds of birds. Even as we permit ourselves to piece together a representational narrative, however, we must also be aware of the potentially fictional nature of such associations. Wait, did I just make that up? Do these sounds come together at the moment of recording or in the process of editing? If we consult the track listing, we will find that what we are now hearing derives from 4 separate field recordings. Whether judging from the liner notes or the sounds alone, however, coming to doubt that our momentary association of all the sounds with a single moment of recording needn't make us reject the fiction so much as recognize it as a fiction. We recognize, in other words, the indefinite nature of what I want to call the scene of recording. I use this phrase to designate the listener's active reconstruction of the recording process, which I want to suggest is implicit in listening to sounds we recognize as field recordings. The scene of recording is indefinite in the sense that it is extremely fallible. At any given moment of listening, I may come to identify what I'm hearing with a single situation in which the recording was made. But because of editing, I cannot know. It's therefore useful to refer to my imaginative reconstruction as a scene in the Freudian sense of an event that is undecidedly observed and imagined, fantasized, or otherwise constructed. At the same time, scene is an apt term for the theatrical or dramaturgical process, as Luc Ferrari termed it, by which recorded sounds inform and also mislead us about their sources. To conclude, however little passages like this one take the extra-musical nature of, say, a buzzing fly or a whooping peacock as a given, we would miss out on much of the passage's richness if we a prioristically deemed all of its elements equally to be music, all music of the same kind. But we'd also miss out if we heard these sounds in reduced fashion simply as a series of pitches, timbre, and amplitudes. Music here appears less as something that categorically happens than as something that is indexed, referenced associatively, as in the object of the piano, or as something that may happen. And yet, of course, music might also be heard in the total relation of all these sonic elements. The movements among kinds of sound and kinds of music are motivated by cues that inhere not only in the nature of the sounds as such, nor even in their purely formal relationship, but also in the way the differences among all the sounds add up variously and are negotiated in a listener's imaginative reconstruction of the process of making the sounds. Thank you.